allow me to describe something of how we will administer today's conference. Frank, if you'll go to the next slide, please. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Enter questions in the Q&A box. The webinar will be recorded and emailed to the registrants, and a link to the conference program can be found in the chat box right there. And having attended to those matters, allow me to introduce Cindy Boden. Cindy, the Chief Mindfulness Officer at Riverwater Partners here in Milwaukee, is also the president of the SGI board.
Thank you, Chris. It's really my pleasure to welcome everyone here today to SGI's 2021 annual conference. Our theme for this year is resilience, building a just and equitable economy for all. And we, the board, felt this was a very appropriate theme in the year coming out of 2020, which brought us COVID and more climate change and more social unrest. And so our panel today and our keynote speaker will be helping us learn more about how we can build a more resilient and just and equitable economy for all. And I want to thank all of the supporters of the work of SGI, our members. We just had a membership meeting, our board, our staff, and of course, our sponsors for today's program, including the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration at the $10,000 sponsorship level, the Sisters of the Sorrowful Mother of St. Clare of Assisi at the $5,000 level, and then all of our sustainer and friend sponsors. We thank you very much for your financial support, as well as many of you participating in the actual work of SGI. And with that, I'd like to mention that today at our member meeting, we also presented the annual Father Mike Crosby Award to Donna Meyer, PhD, who is recently retired from Mercy Investments. And the Father Mike Crosby Award is awarded in honor of the founder of Seventh Generation Interfaith Group, Father Mike Crosby. And Donna Meyer is a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, she's a deserving recipient of this award, as her work has embodied the work of Father Mike Crosby. And so again, we congratulate Donna on receiving this award. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Chris to lead us through today's program.
Thank you, Cindy. We gather this afternoon to talk about resilience, building a just and equitable economy for all. With COVID-19 impacting nearly every aspect of our lives this year and last year, we in the US have been facing 4 historic colliding crises: the pandemic, the economy, systemic racism, and the climate crisis. The 4 are intertwined and part of the same challenges. They are the consequence of decades of actions and inactions that, as they boil over, activate one another. The pandemic has created secondary pandemics around jobs, around hunger, around mental health, a large wealth gap, a lot of debt, and an economic downturn as a formula for conflict. There is a recovery that's happening, but it's helping some people immensely, especially those at the top, and others not at all, especially women, people of color, and low-wage workers. So we will explore those questions first with a keynote address, followed by a panel. Each will have a time of questions and answers, and we encourage you to type your questions into the chat box. So turning now to our keynote address, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. She's the director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Reverend Dr. Theoharis is a busy person. This morning, I followed her on a live stream on Twitter of her, Reverend Dr. Barber, and colleagues advocating for essential low-wage women workers in front of the U.S. Capitol. Later tonight, after this, she's launching her latest book, We Cry Justice, Reading the Bible with the Poor People's Campaign. As well, she's the author of Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor, and co-author of Revive Us Again, Vision and Action in Moral Organizing. She's been published in all those places we love to read: the New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, The Guardian, The Nation, CNN, and Sojourners, to name but a few. Recipient of numerous awards and honors, Reverend Dr. Theoharis received her BA in Urban Studies from the University of Pennsylvania, her MDiv from Union Theological Seminary, and her PhD also from Union in New Testament and Christian Origins. And as an organization based in Milwaukee, I'd be remiss if I did not mention her Wisconsin bona fides. Her parents, Ethan and Nancy, raised her and her siblings here in Milwaukee County. Her father, who died in July, and we extend our condolences, was well known to a number of people on the Zoom today, having taught at Marquette for more than 30 years. Reverend Liz, we are thrilled that you're with us because you are indeed a busy person, and we thank you for the time and taking the time to be with us.
Well, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I love spreading the good news of that ending poverty and building resilient communities is possible. I especially love doing so with a group of folks that are in Wisconsin. And even though I can't be there in person, I really appreciate the invitation to join you all virtually. So indeed, I have been involved in grassroots anti-poverty, anti-racist, pro-environment organizing since for nearly 30 years. And since I began to organize as a part of a movement to end poverty, people have said to me over and over again that our goals are too ambitious, that demands for human rights, human dignity, for a sustainable environment, for a sustainable economy are both politically inconceivable and impossibly expensive. Those folks will quote the Bible, arguing that since Jesus said, "The poor will be with you always," it can't be God's will for everyone to share in the abundance of our world. But as a preacher, as a biblical scholar, as a mother, as a daughter, as a granddaughter, when I read the Bible, including and especially that statement by Jesus, what I see from Genesis throughout the New Testament is a constant revelation of God's will that no one should be made hungry or sick or homeless or underpaid or indebted or bereft by the violence of social, racial, and economic environmental injustice. I read an ongoing indictment of those who would take and keep the wealth and resources of our world for themselves and cause others to suffer. I hear the biblical command to fill the hungry with good things from Luke 1, not as simply caring for the poor as an end result, but by building a movement, advocating for policies and structures that lift the load of poverty, admonishing nations to, in the words of the prophet Jeremiah from chapter 22, do no wrong to the immigrant, the homeless, the children, and do not shed innocent blood. Indeed, throughout our sacred scripture, including the codes and policies, laws, regulations contained within the Bible, as well as the prophets, the gospels, the letters, there is a call to end exploitation, to attend to the poor. There's a mandate of Sabbath rest and Jubilee years. There's prohibition against charging interest on survival loans, profiting off of a pandemic. There are commandments to pay living wages promptly, to bring equity to legal proceedings, to give to everyone who asks of you, to welcome the immigrant neighbor, to care for the needs of the entire community, and to stop depriving the rights of the poor. Whether it's in the book of Moses, the prophetic critique, the parables and ministries told throughout the Bible, God's beautiful creation is lauded. God's intention for that abundance to be a blessing for absolutely all, not an elite few, is the central theme. And in truth, this instruction, these lessons in the scripture, is that society must be organized around the needs of the poor, the suffering, the marginalized. There's a lesson in those texts. It's that when we lift from the bottom, everybody rises. So I want us to think about this as we gather this afternoon, this evening, that in our sacred texts and traditions and in our life today, whenever policies to share in the blessings of creation are lifted up, there's a reminder that exploitation, oppression, the need for struggle for liberation, lest we forget that as long as empire, as injustice, unjust policies, immoral systems are existent, those lead to poverty. But this is not God's will. Ending poverty, having life to the abundance, building resilient and strong communities is possible. After all, that passage weaponized against those challenging the inevitability of poverty and scarcity, saying that we can't really do anything about these pandemics of racism and poverty and inequity. This passage that comes up in Matthew 26, when Jesus says, "The poor will be with you always," is referencing just such a reminder, just such a policy from the prophetic and sacred Hebrew scriptures that in fact says that poverty must and can be ended. Yes, that line from Matthew 26:11 is what evangelical leader Jim Wallace calls the most famous Bible verse on poverty. I hear echoes of this verse when I read Dr. King's statement on true compassion from his time to break the silence sermon at the Riverside Church exactly 1 year before he's killed on April 4th, 1967. I actually, in fact, would like to assert that this may well be Reverend Dr. King's interpretation of Matthew 26:11, "The poor will be with you always." He says, a true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and the justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. I want us to dive a little bit into this biblical roadblock to justice, a little bit more into these ideas from Dr. King. Matthew 26 takes place in the context of a meal with Jesus and his disciples. And I know we're an interfaith group here, and in that context, I want us to look at this biblical passage. It's the Last Supper, and a woman comes and pours an alabaster jar of ointment. It's called myrrh in Greek, on the head right before Judas decides to betray Jesus by turning him over to be crucified. With this action, the woman anoints Jesus. He becomes Christ in the scene. But his disciples, his followers, his friends, and folks around him, they don't get it. They critique the woman for wasting, for destroying the ointment by pouring it on Jesus' head. Even though this very act, anoints him as the Messiah, as a prophet, and prepares him for his burial. They say that instead of breaking the jar, they could have taken that nard, they could have sold it for a year's salary, and then they could have given the money to the poor. This suggestion follows dominant economic systems of oppression during Jesus' day. And this idea of earning lots of money and giving the proceeds to the poor follows how we think we're supposed to address poverty in our day. We're told we're supposed to do charity work. We're told that by buying and selling and then donating to the poor, we're never told that we should question how poverty was created in the first place. But Jesus responds to the disciples, and when he does so, he quotes Deuteronomy 15, one of the most radical Sabbath Jubilee prescriptions in the Bible. Deuteronomy 15 says, There will be no poor person among you if you follow the commandments that God is giving us today. And those commandments are to forgive debts and to release slaves, to lend money, even knowing you won't get paid back, and to raise wages. Deuteronomy 15 continues and says that because people may not follow those commandments, there will always be the poor among you. So when Jesus quotes this phrase, he's not condoning poverty. He's reminding us that God hates poverty, has commanded us to end poverty, and has told us how to do so. We got to cancel debts. We got to raise wages. We got to outlaw slavery. We got to restructure society around the needs of the poor, which means the needs of everybody. Jesus in that passage reminds the disciples that charity will not end poverty, but keep poverty with us. And he also reminds his followers that he's going to be killed for trying to bring God's reign here on earth. And so it is everybody's responsibility, everybody's duty to continue the fight. I'd like to assert that at this moment, this pandemic moment, this economic crisis moment, this moment when the earth is growing and when we have a racial reckoning happening all around, this is a hopeful lesson, but it's also a hard one. We live in a nation, the richest nation in human history, where there are 140 million people who are poor or who are one fire, one healthcare crisis, one job loss, one storm away from deep poverty. A nation where over the past months, year and a half, during a pandemic, tens of millions of people have lost their healthcare, adding to the tens and tens and tens of millions of people who already had inadequate healthcare in the first place. Where tens of millions of renters are behind in rent and could face eviction in the coming months. Where 26 million people reported not having enough to eat in a nation where 72 billion pounds of food goes to waste each year. In truth, these are exactly the times when prophets rise up, remind us of God's demand for justice, but also God's judgment of those whose power and wealth rests on the dispossession and destruction of the rest of society. Jesus' ministry began at a time like ours, when the Roman Empire was strangling millions of poor people and calling it peace. He began his ministry, his organizing career, by drawing directly from the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." The prophet goes on to proclaim liberty to the captives, a phrase that in turn comes from the Jubilee laws of Leviticus. And he reminds us that there shall be no poor person among you if you follow God's will, God's commandments. And yet today, 2021, in Lowndes County, Alabama, families have raw sewage in their yards and mold in their homes. Children need to use CPAP machines just to be able to breathe. In Oak Flats, Arizona, native grave sites are being desecrated. Indigenous families are being pushed out. Grays Harbor, Washington, homeless encampments of millennials are being attacked by the police and by white supremacist militia groups. In Flint, Michigan, 7 years after the Flint water crisis, and in 4 million homes across the United States, moms can buy unleaded gas and unleaded paint, but still can't provide, all these years later, unleaded water for their children. This nation spends 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on military spending, yet we lose more veterans to suicide than to war. The U.S. is engaged in wars declared and undeclared all around the world, but can't take care of vets at home or provide health care for all. And we only spend 15 cents of every discretionary dollar on education and health and anti-poverty programs and living wages. It's with all of this in mind that I want to talk to you about how we can make a change and a movement that is building to change these problems. I am the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and the director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, one of the anchor organizations of the Poor People's Campaign. And in those capacities, we've been traveling around the United States for the last years, and then also putting on Zoom webinars and other forms of social media and communication to kind of convene us all over the past 18 months of this pandemic. From the Bronx to the border, from Appalachia to Aberdeen, from the deep south to the California coast, it has become clear that people are coming together and demanding justice. Our Poor People's Campaign has the understanding that to address poverty, we must simultaneously address 5 interlocking injustices. Those injustices include systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and a distorted moral narrative, a narrative that blames poor people and immigrants and queer people and women for all of society's problems, a narrative that pits us against each other and feeds us a lie that this is as good as it gets, that we can't do any better, that there's scarcity when in fact we actually live in a world of abundance. In our movement, we believe we must have sustained moral movement that engages a broad fusion of people from every walk of life, a movement that engages the nation with moral analysis, moral articulation, moral action. If we have a different moral imagination, if we have policy shifts guided by moral fusion, we can choose a better way. We believe we have to say that if those who want to suppress our votes and our wages and cut education and block healthcare and define who we can love and increase gun rights and deregulate industry and attack immigrants and attack women, if those forces are cynical enough, if they're mean enough to be together, then our fusion movement of Black and white and indigenous and Latino and poor and rich and low-wage workers and care workers, we have to be hopeful enough, smarted enough, united enough to get together. In U.S. history, whenever we've faced forces of regression, moral movements have arisen to call us to higher ground. It's what the abolitionists did in the 19th century. It's what the women suffragists did in the early 20th century. It's what happened in the 1950s and the 1960s when Rosa Parks and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and many other grassroots moral leaders of every race and creed and class and color and sexuality did as they built the civil rights movement. And it's what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Marian Wright Edelman, the National Welfare Rights Organization, and so many others called us in the Poor People's Campaign more than 50 years ago, challenging the nation to address racism, poverty, militarism, before Dr. King was shot and murdered. I want to share another quote, another powerful quote from Reverend Dr. King. I think it has a message for us as we try to talk about sustainability, we talk about resilience, we talk about organizing from the bottom up in this moment. He says that God has left enough and to spare in this world for all God's children to have the basic necessities of life. And God never intended for some of these children to live in inordinate, superfluous wealth, while others live in abject, deadening poverty. And somehow, I believe that God made it all. I believe firmly that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And since we didn't make these things by ourselves, we must share them with each other. I think this is the only way we are going to solve the basic problems and the restructuring of our society, which I think is so desperately needed. We need you all that are gathered in this event this evening across the state of Wisconsin and across other parts of this country in the Poor People's Campaign. We're building a moral movement We're led by the people. We're coming together, we're organizing together, we're uniting together. We're addressing interlocking injustices. We can't separate these issues, racism and poverty and the environment and war. This all comes together. And we must reject a moral narrative of religious nationalism. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more about how we're organized because I believe it actually matters in terms of the work we're trying to do together. Since 2018, the Poor People's Campaign has been building coordinating committees made up of impacted people and clergy and activists and advocates in nearly every state in the country. We engage thousands of volunteer leaders, thousands of clergy, as well as hundreds of thousands of individuals through all the different organizing work that we're doing. We cross the country and across this country, poor and low-income people, religious leaders, and people of conscience. We're coming together, we're breaking through the stubborn silos and forging powerful alliances in communities. So what does this look like? This looks like day-to-day, very place, very local, specific organizing. But also it talks about nationally coordinating in a movement together. This means that we must mobilize and organize and register and engage and educate people for a movement that votes, that protests, and that comes together with real solutions. We have a saying in our work that we cannot just curse the darkness, but we must shine light on all that is possible. We have a bold agenda, and I know that so many of the folks that are gathered with us today also believe in a bold agenda. It costs our nation over $1 trillion to have the level of child poverty that we have in this country. But for every dollar we invest in early childhood education, in building from the bottom, raising up the lives and generations of our young people, it saves our nation $7 in the future. Right now, if we were to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, that would bring more than $300 billion into circulation, where we could help small businesses and we could lift from the bottom and everybody in our communities could be lifted up. We live in a nation that has more abandoned housing than it does folks that are unhoused. And yet we have growing homelessness and misery. My message to you all today is that it does not have to be this way. We can do better, but we can only do better if we organize together, unite together, and show the way possible. And that means being a part of a moral movement, a movement that is made up of people from all walks of life, but that is led by those that are most impacted. I want to end with a quote from Frederick Douglass. He talks about those who would be free must strike the first blow. Those in pain know when their pain is relieved. And he proposed, just like movement leaders throughout this nation and this world's history have said, that we indeed can make a difference, but we can only do so if we come together, organize together, and take the lead of those that are most impacted. So I look forward to the conversation. I look forward to the rest of the conversations you all have in this conference. And as we say in our work, somebody's been hurting our people. It's gone on for far too long, but we won't be silent anymore. And we must move forward together and not one step back. Thank you very much.
Reverend Liz, thank you. And I agree with you, not one step back. It's been too long of a journey to get where we are, and there's still so much further that needs to be done. There's the old phrase, familiarity breeds contempt, the way in which sometimes when we've heard scripture so long, it fails to kind of pierce our consciousness. And that I think some of the ways that you've unpacked some of those scriptures that are so very familiar to us have kind of opened up some some new ways that it kind of hits the conscience and hits the heart, and really very appreciative for what you've shared with us. Want to ask people, please feel free in the Q&A box to put your questions that you want to bring to Reverend Liz, and know that we'll work through those and also kind of continue the conversation a bit here. But again, I'll repeat myself and just say thank you for breaking apart our familiarity with some of those stories and helping us bring new eyes to it. You know, maybe this too. Part of the way we conceive of ourselves and the work that we do is that most of our members are from religious communities, and religious communities that are working even in missions, but some in places of privilege, but also always with folks that are working with some of the most on the periphery, the poor. And that connection, that proximity, Brian Stevenson might talk about, helps bring an awareness into shareholder meetings, into the C-suite. You know, that like you all have been particularly trying to bring to the conscience of the country, and with things like what you've done earlier this morning at the Capitol, or other things that have restricted your movements for certain periods of time. You want to say a little bit about some of the way you've spoken a little bit about how you bring the voice of the poor into this, and maybe you've touched on in quite a few ways that we can bring those voices and have to lift those voices. Maybe I'll put that one too as it is.
Perfect. So we have a saying in our work that I think actually really speaks to what you're talking about. And that's that movements begin with the telling of untold stories, right? That actually, you know, hearing the stories and the solutions coming out of grassroots communities is how we indeed can make a change. In order to build a movement, we have identified two major things that have to happen. One is that we have to shift the narrative. We have to get our nation, get our world, get our communities, get our ministries talking and acting about the real issues that are impacting people. And how do you shift the narrative? Well, part of how you do it is by shifting the narrators, right? You put into the driver's seat, into the public discourse, into the conversation, those who, like we did this morning, who are essential workers that have had to be on the front lines of this public health crisis and the front lines of trying to address this economic crisis, and yet who have been called essential but treated as expendable. And by having folks out there and in a conversation about what kind of policies should we be investing in, what kind of cost is it, not of how much does a Build Back Better plan cost us, but what does it cost this nation, and what does it cost poor and low income people, and especially women's lives, if we don't invest, if we don't bring into our communities, you know, childcare and paid sick leave and healthcare and living wage jobs and everything that people need to thrive and not just barely survive. And so part of the work is about shifting the narrative. For too long, for generations really, or at least a generation, poverty and the word poor has become a four-letter word. We don't hear, if we do hear about the issues of poverty and the poor, it's to pity or punish poor people. But it's not to say that there's a structural reality that is making it impossible for people to get ahead. I mean, what is it that we live in the richest country in the world, and yet nearly half of our people are experiencing some form of poverty, and more than half of our kids in this rich nation are going to bed at hungry, or at least in food insecure homes, right? So we got to shift this narrative. But then to shift the narrative and to actually enact real change, what we need is to build power. The kind of power that people, you know, come together across communities and insist, in the words of Dr. King, that the powers you make those in power say yes when they may be desirous of saying no, right? If we look at history, what we see is that change is possible, but it's only possible when people are out there, especially those that are impacted, demanding change and saying, we cannot wait 1 minute more for this kind of change, and our lives depend on it. And we see that it takes that kind of pressure, it takes that kind of organizing, it takes that kind of narrative shift and the telling of untold stories to be able to come forward with the kind of power that then indeed can crumble mountains. And so I think that this is a really central part of the work, and it's something that applies to every locale, every area. What are the key issues that are impacting our communities? Who is being most impacted? Are we hearing their solutions? Are we hearing their voices? And are we coming together and putting those forward in a powerful way so as to be able to enact change?
Thanks. That of changing the narrative, you hinted in your talk of a false narrative around religious freedom. Could you kind of expand on that?
Yeah, so I think it's more we talk about religious nationalism, and in particular kind of Christian nationalism, which is actually very different than religious freedom. Right now, the Poor People's Campaign is supporting with very fiercely the religious freedom demands of our indigenous brothers and sisters from the Apache stronghold, whose most sacred land, where the spirits dwell, is being threatened to be destroyed by a copper mining industry. But and their right to practice a free practice of religion is being denied. But some of that is in the name of really religious and Christian nationalism, and that kind of nationalistic forces that we see, creeping up in so many places across the nation and across the world. And that Christian nationalism, has defined that, that a white supremacist, Christian supremacist, kind of god of violence should be it should be at the center of society, instead of, if we want to talk about, Christianity, at that first inaugural sermon of Jesus's, the Spirit of God is upon me, he has anointed me to preach good news, evangelism to the Potokos, to those who may have been poor through policy violence, right? So how is it possible that we can have folks that call themselves evangelicals who are not bringing the good news of living wages, the good news of expanded healthcare, the good news of of thriving and education for our kids, the issues, the real moral issues that our sacred texts and traditions, that our Constitution takes up. And so we believe that we have to push back against this religious and especially Christian nationalism. Sometimes it shows up in a form that we all define as something that's about the demise of the people, but sometimes it crops in similar to regular people just like ourselves, who believe that if God wanted to address these issues, God would do so, and all of these kind of false narratives that exist, that help to prop up a system of injustice and the status quo.
We've got quite a few questions, but maybe I'll go with one real practical one that shows up in both the Q&A and in the chat, which is folks who are in different places, like say Wisconsin, how can they get involved in the kind of local work of the Poor People's Campaign? Is there a website where they
There is indeed. There's multiple ways to get involved. So the Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival, is organizing in Wisconsin. There is a state coordinating committee in Wisconsin. And if you go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, you can find out contact information for folks in Wisconsin. You can also sign up to join our kind of email list. And by signing up for that email list, the folks in Wisconsin that are organizing as the Poor People's Campaign will get your information and can reach out and get more connected. but you know, it's not enough just to sign up or to reach out to the folks, you know, in Wisconsin that are organizing. What we know is that we need a movement of millions, right? A movement that has going to have people from every town and city across the state, and we believe that a national movement is made up of state-based movements, right? And we have to nationalize these state struggles. And so, you know, if folks are organizing to resist evictions in Milwaukee, if folks are organizing to promote Indigenous rights in different states, different parts across the state, if folks are organizing against police brutality and for environmental and climate resilience, we need everybody in all of those struggles to, you know, come together. There are more resources about ways to kind of get involved and also understand the kind of larger moral vision of the Poor People's Campaign on the Poor People's Campaign website. I encourage folks to look at a moral budget that we put together, to look at a resolution that was introduced to the U.S. House this past spring that talks about building a third Reconstruction. Now, the first Reconstruction was right after the Civil War, and it was a powerful experiment in democracy, and it was beaten down by regressive forces. We say that the second Reconstruction was the Civil Rights Movement, where the real possibility of folks coming together and organizing together, including in the Poor People's Campaign, the last campaign of Dr. King's life, was also is also under attack. But we believe that this moment, this Kairos moment, this time where new movements are breaking through and old systems and structures of injustice are breaking down, this is a moment to be building a third Reconstruction. So we worked with communities and came up with an agenda, and that inspired Congress people to introduce. So Pramila Jayapal and Congresswoman Barbara Lee introduced it. There's dozens and dozens of Congress people that have signed on. And so it also gives you a sense of the kinds of issues that we're taking up and the kinds of demands that we're trying to push through, and the resolve that it's going to take. The resolve that the people in power in this nation and all of us across our communities need to have to really address poverty and low wages and racism from the bottom up, but fully address those and build these climate and economic resilient communities.
We've gotten actually a couple of questions that dig into kind of the policy side of that, broadly, and I'll connect two of them together. One, how would available funds best be shared effectively toward the objectives that you're so eloquently sharing? And somebody gives a more specific attention to it, talking about Edgar Klein, who writes about addressing poverty from the supply side. For example, in Texas, we need early childhood education. Should the emphasis be on making this education really affordable, or giving low-income families more money to pay the growing costs of this education?
Well, I think that when it comes to a question like this, we need to do it all, and we can. We have the resources, right? But indeed, if we look at something more like housing, for instance, usually what happens when we're in a housing crisis, what happened in 2007, 2008, what's beginning to happen now is that who gets bailed out is the realtors. But what does it look like to bail out the renters and the mortgage holders, right? What is it? It's far less costly to actually, pay people a living wage, get people subsidies for housing, to get money in the hands of people so they can afford education and all these other opportunities, but also to see that this is what society should be about, and that investing in those programs and making them affordable and making them a right, a guarantee, and not just an opportunity, not just a means tested way of getting something, that this isn't actually the way that we can kind of lift the load of poverty. What we've seen, in this pandemic should show us something. It's that when you put money in people's pockets, when especially you try to take seriously the problems that people and families are having, and you use structures, governmental and others, to be able to lift people up, it has an impact. Now, that should be a lesson that it therefore should not be that we have the levels of of inequity and the lack of opportunity that exists in so many places, and that there are ways to address these issues. And again, there's powerful different policies and programs being introduced right now that can actually help do all of that.
And you talked a lot about building power and the kind of power that's needed to change the direction. There's a question that's kind of looking at like, to start, does that start in terms of being most effective at the community, local level, the national level, the corporate level, some other level?
So again, I think it's a little bit of a both and situation here, right? We always, all politics is local, and so you always have to start with where you are. And that's something I learned, from my late father. Where you are is the ground zero of the fight for voting rights, the fight for economic rights, the fight for immigrant rights. I mean, because we have all of those issues happening around us, anywhere we are. But it's not enough to stay local. You have to see that what's happening in the south side of Chicago and the north side of Milwaukee, as well as the holler in West Virginia, is actually connected. And so for instance, in this time, it's not enough for us to have state action. We need also federal and national action on issues. We need corporate action on issues, but I thoroughly and fundamentally believe that where change comes from is definitely from above, but it's also from below. That I think about one of my favorite passages in the Bible, from Luke, where we have a story of the persistent widow who goes to this unjust judge. This judge is described as someone who does not care about any human and does not fear God. And this woman keeps coming and coming and pleading her case, saying she demands justice. Now, the thing about this story is that she wins justice in the end, but it's not because his heart was opened up and he all of a sudden saw the errors of his ways. It was that she was persistent. She was powerful, a poor woman who had nothing but the call and desire to actually live a just and full life. She was able to enact change, and she compelled that unjust judge to do the right thing. And I think that there's a powerful story in there and in so many of our sacred texts about the power that comes from below, the power that comes from the people acting together, uniting together, coming together across the lines that divide us, and putting forward a vision of society that lifts everybody up.
When days are dark, it's important that we find little lights of hope, and thinking about those different places where things need to happen. So I'll mention some places and see if you've got somebody or some institution that gives you a little hope. Among other things, we can feel the energy from the room around you, and I suspect that's one place of hope and of life for the movement. But we'll start with one that kind of touches in some of our work, which is there a corporation or somebody in the business world that strikes you as a sign of hope?
So I think one of the things that has been inspiring, and it's kind of connected to the last point I was making about, the people organizing from below. For many, many years now, for really more than a decade, I've been working with a group of farm workers down in Southwest Florida called the Coalition of Monthly Workers. And folks, from a little unknown town when I met them in the late 90s to now, have been able to bring deep and beautiful partnerships with many of the biggest fast food corporations and grocery stores in the world, and so it's kind of amazing to see that Taco Bell Corporation, McDonald's, Chipotle, various kind of Stop and Shop, Whole Foods have all been moved by these low wage, many immigrant farm workers who have said, we need to be treated not as tractors, but as human beings with dignity. And so I think that that's a hopeful example where you can bring some of the most powerful corporations in the world to do the right thing by people organizing together. I mean, obviously there's other examples, powerful examples of these socially responsible businesses, and we in the Poor People's Campaign have, benefited from, connection with various different groups, but again, always coming from this place of people, and the people power that then compels these businesses to do the right thing.
It occurs to me in talking about the Coalition for Immokalee Workers that there's a little bit of Lazarus and the rich man there, that for so long, the rich man could not see Lazarus as a human being. And in that case, these farm workers being the Lazarus and the companies actually finally seeing them as human beings. I think that's a really strong note to hope with which we can draw this to a close. We are so grateful for your time, Reverend Liz. And we wish, there are people eager to support the Poor People's Campaign. It's been placed in the chat how to be able to connect with the Poor People's Campaign. And I'm inspired by seeing the ways that you and Reverend Dr. Barber and others are facing even arrest at times to help stir the conscience of our country around these critical issues. Thank you for taking the time with us. And we look forward as well to reading the scriptures alongside you and your colleagues, and wish you the best this evening as you launch that book. Thank you so very, very, very much.
Thank you so much, and have a blessed evening and continued gathering.
Appreciate it. You've given us a lot to reflect on as we move into our panel now. And just thank you again.
Thank you.
Allow me to please then to introduce Caroline Boden. Caroline is a director of shareholder advocacy with Mercy Investment Services. She's responsible for engagements around issues such as nutrition, the reduction of food and plastic waste, human trafficking, and safer chemical management. Prior to joining Mercy Investment Services in 2016, Caroline was a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. She also served as a political intern with the U.S. Department of State, where she worked on U.S.-European political and economic relations. Caroline holds a BA degree in French and International Studies from Illinois Wesleyan University and an MS in European politics from the University of Glasgow. She is a tremendous colleague in so many engagements within ICCR and SGI. I'd add she too has Wisconsin bona fides, being a native of the Green Bay area. And I'm so appreciative of her leadership in moderating the following panel. Caroline, please.
Thank you, Chris, for that very kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this year's SGI conference. As has been noted, the theme for this year's conference is resilience, building a just and equitable economy for all. And what a perfect framing we've just heard from Reverend Dr. Theoharis. And it's been well over a year since the COVID-19 pandemic began, and we've seen how devastating it's been for healthcare systems, the economy, and especially for frontline workers and the most vulnerable in society. The COVID-19 crisis has both illuminated and intensified economic inequality, the disproportionate impacts borne by people of color, women, and low-income communities. More than 2.3 million women have left the US labor force since February 2020, leaving their labor force participation rate at the lowest it's been since 1988. At least 24% of US workers don't have access to paid sick leave, and the lowest paid workers are the least likely to have access. This devastating impact of lack of paid sick leave and other benefits was particularly evident in the meatpacking industry, where over 50,000 workers contracted COVID, 87% of which were workers of color. And hundreds of thousands of restaurant workers have left their jobs due to low wages, lack of benefits, and systemic discrimination and harassment. And yet we've also seen how some companies have stepped up to do the right thing and protect their workers and communities, and how the American public supports a shift away from business as usual. According to Just Capital, for instance, 89% of polled Americans believe the pandemic represents an opportunity for companies to hit reset and focus on doing right by all of their stakeholders. We're seeing at both the corporate level and the federal level with President Biden's Build Back Better agenda that our society is at a pivotal moment where we can take the lessons learned from this pandemic, including its most devastating impacts, and create a society and systems that are equitable. And so to help us talk through these challenges and identify, hopefully, some potential solutions, we have a great panel of speakers. And it's my pleasure to introduce each of them. First, I'd like to introduce Edgar Hernandez, who is the Assistant Director of the Service Employees International Union, Department of Strategic Initiatives. Previously, Edgar served as the Assistant Director of the SEIU's Capital Stewardship Program. And the focus of his work is to interact with public and private sector pension funds and trustees on investment, corporate governance, and retirement security issues. Edgar is also the co-lead on the SEIU's Diversity and Dollars Initiative, and he serves as a deputy trustee for the SEIU Master Trust Pension Fund that has $3 billion in assets under management. He received his BA in Political Science and Latin American Studies and a Master in Urban Planning and Policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Next, I'd like to introduce Sister Sue Ernster, who is a member of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration based in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and is currently serving as Vice President and Treasurer of the F.S.P.A. Sister Sue previously served on SGI's board, and she, along with the F.S.P.A. congregation, have been an active member of SGI, ICCR, and shareholder advocacy work for a number of years. Sister Sue holds a BA in accounting from Boris College in Dubuque, Iowa, as well as a Master of Arts in Pastoral Ministry from St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. And finally, I'd like to introduce Kevin Williams, who is the Director of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at American Airlines. Kevin joined American in January 2019 as the Director of People Business Partners, where he supported a variety of operational and corporate functions prior to joining the diversity team in 2021. Kevin is responsible for developing and executing the company's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy to ultimately support American's business objectives. Prior to joining American Airlines, Kevin held many human resources leadership roles at Toyota North America and Brinker International. And he holds an MBA in organizational development from the University of Dallas, a BBA in management from Midwestern State University, and his PHR certification. And Kevin also serves on the board of directors for the Junior Players, a local nonprofit providing underserved youth exposure to arts education. So Edgar, I'm going to turn to you first, and in your role at SEIU, help us sort of further frame the discussion and some of the comments that we heard from Reverend Theoharis by walking us through what you're hearing and seeing from workers in terms of the ongoing impacts of COVID and systemic inequities, and how those impacts might vary across different sectors.
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and share some of our experiences from SEIU and our members. I think it's really exciting to follow up on the comments that were made by the good Reverend Doctor. She's someone that SEIU has worked with very closely over the course of the years, and pretty much has really tapped and highlighted a lot of the issues that we're working on. And so just by way of background, SEIU represents workers in three various sectors. First and foremost is the healthcare sector, the public sector for government employees in state, county, and municipal governments, and then also in the property services sectors. And those particular property services sectors really focus on janitors and security officers for large commercial properties. And so from what we've seen in terms of just on the healthcare side, we've seen that our members that are on the front lines of this COVID fight are really exhausted. They're tired. They've been working both ends, burning the candle on both ends. And so they're very exhausted. They've seen the challenges in terms of not being able to, on the onset, have sufficient amount of PPE available to themselves. They've had to face rationing of those types of materials, which is not a good thing overall. But I think, one of the things that they're also starting to see is that in some areas where the vaccines are not being utilized by the local populations on a basis that would help drive down some of the numbers, that they've seen spikes in terms of just outbreaks to levels that we're seeing sometime around last year. And I think that's been of a challenge for most folks overall, right? When we thought that we may have seen that we may have turned the corner a little bit in terms of making some progress, that we've fallen back. And I think that's been a bit of a challenge. And I think for our members that are in the public sector, spaces, they've been having to perform their work while in some cases working on a hybrid basis, whether they're at home permanent, full-time on a temporary basis, or that they've been having to go into the office on a temporary basis. It really limits their abilities to execute some of their job functions because they may not have all of the necessary equipment available to them in their homes. So I think it's a bit of a challenge, but at the same time, with all of the things that have been going on, we've seen that some of these municipalities and state entities have also experienced shortfalls in their budgets. And so there's been some tightening of belts that we've experienced in terms of just having some of our members possibly, face some kind of furloughs and things of that sort, or maybe even laid off and called back. So that's been of a challenge as well. I think lastly, for the members that are in the commercial services space, our members in the janitorial divisions, more specifically, they were hit hard as well as a result of when the shutdowns came down in March of 2020 of last year. A lot of people weren't going to the offices. And so our members were no longer needed in order to ensure that that the offices were cleaned. And so, for example, we may have seen that in one, office building in downtown areas, it may take a crew of maybe 10 to 20 folks to clean a large scale of buildings. Well, that wasn't the case anymore because people weren't going to those buildings on a consistent basis. So then the building managers decided to go ahead and reduce the workforce to skeleton crews to maybe 3 to 5 workers. And so they were laid off and they had to face the challenges of not having some of their benefits that they were used to available to themselves. And so I think that's been a bit of a challenge overall. But I will say that in the security services side, our members that were responsible for providing security services for those large-scale commercial properties, they were still required to go to work. And so they were still there to make sure that, if something was taking place, that they were there to be able to provide those services. And so I think overall, we experienced it very front, from a very a way in which that we experienced it very front. And we saw that on all of the 3 sectors, our members were on the front lines of this. So, but I think at the end of the day, what we've also saw is that we needed to ensure that they were able to access PPE equipment, and that was something that initially was just not available to them. And I think that was a big challenge. And we've understood that going forward, that was something that they wanted to ensure that as we continue to bargain for new contracts as they became open this past year in certain markets, that was one of the bargaining items that they wanted to make sure that was covered as part of these negotiations. And so I think overall, though, I think that's what we've experienced in terms of our membership.
Thank you, Edgar, for that overview and helping to frame out your experience and that of the members of SEIU in these different sectors and how they've been impacted by the pandemic and the challenges that they've been facing. Kevin, I want to come to you next. And I first want to commend American Airlines for really all the steps that the company has taken to keep both employees and customers safe and healthy during the pandemic, including some of the most recent efforts as it relates to vaccinations. And really as well, also commend the company for some of the expanded commitments in addressing racial, gender, and economic inequities. So I want to ask if you could explain how COVID, as well as some of that reckoning around racial justice, has really impacted the company's business model, and what are some of the lessons learned from the past year for American Airlines, and how are those being integrated into sort of business strategies and goals going forward?
Sure. Thanks, Caroline. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share really kind of some of the work that we're doing here at American Airlines. So as you mentioned, COVID had just a really huge impact on us as an organization, but as an industry, right? And we're still, in many ways, still working through kind of the other side and what that looks like for us as we look to what the future of the airline is, right? And so as we think about, from a business perspective, it impacted us in really a few ways. So one, as we think about our customer base, right? So we were, very heavily business traveled. And now, as we all know, business travel has all but ceased. And so really the shift in our customer base and at us becoming more of a leisure travel airline really required different needs for us. And so not only us from a, how do we best take care of those customers, but also too, what do we need to provide to our team members as our customer base shift, right? And so it really has made us really rethink about not only things from a customer service perspective, but routes, right? What are the routes that we fly? Where are we, going to travel? Where's the demand? And really helping us be more deliberate about those things, right? Even as we think about our international flying is still, very much restricted. So we don't anticipate that, and even business travel to come back into 2022. So we've really had to really focus in from a domestic perspective and really determine how do we continue to be what our customers need and fly to the places where they need to go. And then also as well, really, COVID it really required us to be more nimble than we ever have been as an organization. And so one of the key learnings that we had is really that we have to be agile, we have to be nimble, we have to be able to make changes within our network, within our system, and make changes to protocols, policies, procedures very quickly, right? You mentioned, vaccines, right? That vaccine mandate came out pretty quickly, and we had to make a decision around policies, procedures. How do we best support our team members through those processes? I think, being an organization of our size, being agile and nimble is something that probably was it was kind of a new muscle for us. And I think now that we've realized going through COVID is something that we will have to continue to be, for us to stay competitive and for us to continue to bring value to our team members and our customers. I think from a racial injustice perspective and really the impact that had on us as an organization is really kind of, it's multifaceted. So, first I think about our team members and really for us, how it was important for us to really listen to our team members and have an understanding of really how our team members felt after all the things that they were experiencing, every day. And beyond like our team members, it really was then how are we equipping our leaders to have these conversations? So as we think about our transient workforce of pilots, flight attendants, folks that are working in our airports, it was important for us to equip our leaders with the skills and the tools and the what they need to ensure that they are equipped to have these conversations as our team members were dealing with kind of a racial injustice or awakening or reckoning that we hadn't experienced in many years in this country, right? And so that was important. But also too, I'm sure everyone has seen really some of interactions that are now happening with customers, right? And so some of it was spurred based on racial injustice, some of it spurred based on mask mandates, and just some of the tensions that we've had in our country over the past couple years now. And so not only is it about kind of supporting our team members internally, it's been important for us to look at our policies and procedures with our customers to ensure that we are keeping our team members safe, not only from COVID, but really from customer interactions as well. As we look at how in the skies, we've seen so many more assaults and things on our team members. It's record breaking. And so really, how are we showing up for our team members to show that we care? And also to stand, letting our customers know really kind of what is acceptable for us here at American as we support, again, team members and our other customers. There's a few things that we did just to really kind of dial in, and I mentioned listening. So we hosted 600 listening sessions and continue to do that as we continue just to talk and listen. But beyond listening, we're saying, how do we turn those insights into action? So we're taking actions now to really have an impact on our organization from how do we operate in the future, and then how do we best support our team members from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. Also, too, we're really working to tell our story, right? Tell our story with our team members of the things that we are doing. So again, I mentioned we are 85% of our team members are in the field. So either in reservation offices, in airports, flying in the skies. And so it's important for us to really ensure that our messaging to our team members is multifaceted. So team members really understand all of the things that we're doing in support of them and our customers as we go through times that are just unprecedented for us as an airline. I will say that we're continuing to learn and grow each and every day. And, we are doubled down on our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to ensure that we are promoting equity within the organization and supporting the communities that we serve. And I will say that we are continuing to learn from COVID. And I think as we learn something each and every day, but it has definitely challenged us as an organization to be more innovative, be more open, and make decisions a lot more quickly based on the needs, the rapidly changing environment.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. And I appreciate that overview. And there's definitely some specifics you mentioned that I want to circle back to, and when we continue the conversation sort of about what are the needs of workers in this ongoing environment. But I'm gonna turn to Sister Sue next, just to sort of again help with this initial framework. And so, Sister Sue, the F.S.P.As, they engage in socially responsible investing and shareholder advocacy. You're a member of SGI and SEIU. And of course, I think very importantly, you bring a faith-based perspective to that work, as do so many of the members of SGI who are listening to this conference this evening. So as an investor with that very particular framework, what are your expectations of companies that you hold in your portfolio as they address the challenges from the pandemic, as well as systemic inequalities that we've touched on so far today?
Thank you, Carolyn, for the opportunity to respond, as well as serving on the panel with Edgar and Kevin. I'm really humbled to be on this panel. Some of our expectations as the different corporations address the challenges from the pandemic and the inequalities that have really been raised and that we can no longer ignore is that we expect them to be a good citizen, a good neighbor, a global neighbor, leaving the world better and more resilient than when they arrived, realizing that it isn't only about the bottom line or profit, and that we as shareholders are letting our voices be heard, that we have concerns besides the largest bottom line possible. And as part of our engagement with companies, and when we're looking at companies to invest in or to engage in for shareholder advocacy, is how are they addressing the gaps they have? Are they able, as Kevin alluded to and mentioned about being nimble, are they able to have a more comprehensive plan on how they are being better or resilient and not relying on what has previously worked in the past, engaging with their workers and their different supply chains? Because we've learned during the pandemic that a supply chain is definitely one of the issues, and how do they navigate that? And we see this as not just a one area proposal or proposition, but rather really inclusive of the intersectionality of racism, migration, and climate change. Because as climate change and as part of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions are addressed, those are going to impact those that are most affected, those that are living in the neighborhoods that don't have the best access to everything else that others do. Also, deforestation. And the supply chain also includes the sustainability of the products, how they are produced. Or what is the product that they're selling? Is it sustainably made? As well as, and Edgar has mentioned this, the fair treatment of the workers, including the livable wages, the education, and the training that is needed for them. And as part of our process, we do engage with our broker and our managers in those discussions when we're discussing with the companies. And we also expect that as part of the annual reporting to us as shareholders to include part of their ESG. What are they doing for the environment, and reporting on how they're going to be decreasing their carbon footprint or their alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement, as well as the sustainability of their practice, the way they're doing it, and the products. And then as we're looking at governance, what is the percentage of their board members? What diversity is on their board as well as among their workforce? And, you know, how are they addressing the equity gap in their organization?
Thank you, Sister Sue. That's a wonderful laundry list of the things that I think SGI members and investors that we can take back to companies in our engagements. But thank you for helping to summarize some of what we're looking for when we talk with companies and when we engage in this work. And I think it's really clear from all three of your comments and this framing that there are broad systemic changes that we really need to help address some of these gaps, these inequities, especially that workers are facing. So I have a question for both Edgar and Kevin that I'd love each of your perspective on. And it deals with, and Edgar, you alluded to it in terms of SEIU members asking for PPE, for instance, to be included in some of those bargaining contracts. And Kevin, some of the asks of workers at American Airlines. But I'd love a little bit more from each of you in terms of, as we're, again, sort of coming out of the, I guess, sort of the first phase or phases of the pandemic and looking at sort of building back better and creating new systems. What have you been hearing from workers in terms of what they need, whether it's increased wages or PPE or paid sick leave? And what are then, I guess, the sort of systems level changes that need to happen to get to those changes and fulfill those needs of? So I'll open it up to both Edgar and Kevin.
Yeah, so Kevin, it's all right if I can just jump right in first. And so I think for us as SEIU, we actually launched a campaign earlier this year called Respect Us, Protect Us, Pay Us. And it really enumerated 5 actual points that we were looking forward in terms of just what our members are asking for. I think overall, though, I think it was the first and foremost point was the freedom of association, with freedom of workers to go ahead and bargain collectively, to have a union on their workplace if they so chose to. And then I think the second point was to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour nationally. We understand that some states have already taken some action, right? But, all the studies have pointed out that if wages kept up with, the inflation rate, that the true number of that should be $22 an hour, right? But I think at this point in time, we understand the challenges of trying to get something like that done. But we would think that a national minimum wage of $15 an hour would be something that would help working families to go ahead and be able to provide for themselves and their children. We also wanted to make sure that, once again, PPE, right? What are those safeguards and protocols that are going to be put in place to protect workers once they return back to full-time employment in their workplaces? And at the same time, that if they are being asked to go ahead and work in a condition that is hazardous, that they would also receive hazard pay. And I think, just given the situation that globally we have experienced, that the notion of not being able to offer family paid healthcare is just something that is mind-blowing to me at this point in time. But I think at the same time, that is something that we want to make sure that every worker has the option and ability to attain, is to have paid family health care. And then lastly, just, pay time off. If you get sick, the last thing you want to do is show up to work and get the rest of your colleagues sick. So pay time off is something that's really important for us. And I think for us, 2 things that we've experienced recently. Our members that are janitors in the Denver International Airport currently are on strike, asking for these very same points that I just mentioned currently. And so I think that's a bit of a challenge for us to try to make sure that we also are able to bargain collectively for these low-wage workers that are asking for these same points that I just mentioned. And I think the other piece of it, though, we represent healthcare workers in Seattle, in the northern suburb of Seattle, that work in a behavioral healthcare system, Cascade. And we've seen that there's been a heightened increase of our members getting assaulted, beat up by some of the residents in those behavioral facilities. And the company there has not been willing to provide the adequate level of security staffing to make sure that our members are safe when they go and conduct their jobs there. And so they're on strike now, and they've been on strike for almost 2 weeks. I'm sorry, almost 2 months now, asking for these very same principles, and also in addition to that, to make sure that there's adequate secure staffing levels. And I think that's something that, as Kevin mentioned as well, folks, experiencing that on airlines. But I think it's important for us to elevate that issue a lot more, because I think that's something that's going on or has been going on for quite some time that has just really come to light. And I think overall, the one thing I forgot to mention in terms of just who we as SEIU are, a majority of our members are women. A majority of our members are people of color. A significant representation of our members are also immigrants, whether they're from Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, or Eastern Europe. We have a significant immigrant population as part of our membership. So all of these issues that we're discussing are really important for us on many levels, from a racial equity perspective, from a racial justice perspective. So we take these issues very seriously, and we work on them to try to influence the opportunities for our members to work with dignity and also be safe on their job as well.
Thanks, Edgar. Kevin, go ahead.
For sure. So a couple things that come to mind for me is one, our team members have really been very vocal over the last 18 months in holding the organization accountable. So accountability is something that is, even more elevated and expressed more than I would say we have ever seen before. And trust. They want to trust that the organization does have their best interest at mind, and that trust the processes and procedures that we have are fair and that they are equitable. And so there's things that we're doing to help support kind of our team members along the way from a diversity perspective through the pandemic, all of those things. So some of it, Edgar touched on, but as I think about, as we are still living through the pandemic leave, offering time off for if you are sick or if you come in contact or things of that nature, right? So ensuring that we are constantly looking at our leave policies to say, what are we doing to best support our team members as they continue to deal with impacts of COVID-19. Also as well, through this, we've been working with our benefits team to really ensure that our team members had access to all of their benefits from a financial perspective, if it was additional financial support that was needed, or from a medical benefits perspective as well, right? And so ensuring that we were having conversations, providing regular updates to our team members and access to maybe benefits that they weren't even aware of that come with just being a part of kind of our programs and plans. And it's been very interesting for us as we think about really the impact that even COVID has had on women not re-entering, but exiting the workforce, right? And so really, as we think about flexibility and how do we be flexible with, it's one thing for us to be flexible here at the corporate office, right? That's one piece. But as we think about in our airport operations, what does flexibility look like? How can we best support all of our team members through the different challenges that have come through COVID? And I won't say that we've got it all perfect, but we are really thinking about how do we be more accommodating and flexible by looking at our policies and our procedures and ensuring they're not so rigid as they have been in the past. I will say there's things that we've done to really show that we are committed to this idea of equity, that we are committed to diversifying the workforce. 25% of our board of directors are female and are Black. So as you think about things that we've done to really say that this is important, we started with the board and we've set representation goals within the organization for our levels of leadership to ensure that we are putting not only actions into place, but we're seeing the results, right? To hold ourselves accountable to those results. Also too, we've really been focusing on kind of the equity pay gap, and we were just awarded a certification for fairness in equity and pay. And really what does that means is that we have done the work and commit to do the work continuously to close that gap. And so as we see inequities, we did a review this year of all of our management support staff team members. As we saw any issues or any gaps, we took steps that we could to reduce those gaps and close those gaps as much as possible. And we'll continue continue to do that review with our compensation team every year to ensure, or multiple times throughout the year, actually, to ensure that we are looking at that, at the pay gap, and ensuring that we are not allowing it to get away from us. And we are addressing issues as they arise within the organization. You know, I mentioned earlier about us listening. Listening is so important for what we do, just to understand what we can do to support our team members. But also there's other things that we've doing around learning. So ensuring that we are training and providing opportunities for our team members to have open conversations around race in the workplace, around what they're seeing in the world around them, and equipping our leaders for that, which I mentioned. And lastly, being very intentional about the recruitment and the advancement of people of color and women within the organization. So I mentioned representation goals, which we set for the first time in 95 years as a company, based on our biggest opportunities from a representation perspective. So we are working diligently with strategies to close our representation gap, but also as well, we are not only from a management support staff, but in our frontline ranks as well. So as I think about, we are being very more intentional about the diversification of our pilots, right? As we are now hiring pilots again that we haven't in a few years, we are now being very targeted about diversifying our pilot ranks, because we have huge opportunities there from women and people of color. Also, as well as we think about mechanics, we have a mechanic population that still needs to has an opportunity to be diverse. And so we're now being more targeted in our strategies of reaching out to schools, colleges, starting earlier in education, to build this idea around careers in aviation and educating communities and underrepresented groups and minorities on what it means to build a career in aviation and how we can best support that.
Thank you both. Yeah, and a couple things that I think really sort of jumped out at me in terms of themes. One, accountability and trust. Kevin, I think that was so perfect, that is a key to how or what's necessary for workers sort of going forward, and for them to feel confident that the sort of corporate headquarters or the big boss really has their best interests at heart and is there to support them. And then as well, the comments about pay equity, I think that's a perfect segue. I wanted Sister Sue to give you the opportunity to share what the F.S.P.As have done, because I think that this is really a great example of, as a faith-based investor and a faith-based organization, really living the values that we're also asking of corporate America. So if you could share what the F.S.P.As have done in terms of addressing pay equity and the minimum wage, that would be great.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. And yes, as part of our self-reflection process, we've been engaged with ICCR and Seventh Generation for a long time. And we got to take another deep dive into it this year when we were engaging Walmart on our proposal, requesting that they prepare a report on how their racial justice goals and commitments align with the starting pay for all classification of their associates. And part of that was also, really, can you raise the minimum to at least $15 an hour? And we realized that if we're asking others to do this, we need to be looking at ourselves. And so as of July, we raised our minimum wage to $15 an hour. And it went over pretty well with some of our staff who had got the bigger raises. And as part of that, we did a compression to not have compression. We really adjusted the other wages accordingly, so that there wouldn't be this, I've been here a long time and they're getting this raise and what happened to me? So we adjusted that accordingly, and that took some work on our part. And we value our staff. We call them our partners in mission. And so as part of living our values, this is what we felt we needed to do. And also when we're engaging companies, we kind of look at, are they going to be changing enough to fit our values or not? And so when do we divest, such as from fossil fuels? If they're not really going to be changing their practices, when do we exit that strategy? And in 2018, which kind of goes to this, the minimum wage, we as a congregation agreed on some specific areas that we were going to focus on, and they help guiding our process as well in what we're in our investing, and when we're investing in what we're calling impact investing, which is not in the stock market, but in private equities and cooperatives. And so the shortened version is that we're looking at how we're unveiling our white privilege. What does that really mean for us? Because we are a privileged congregation, being people who stand with all suffering in our earth community, and then joyful gospel living. And as we really unpacked and continue to unpack white privilege, we are asking ourselves, how have we benefited from the current system that has excluded others? And how do we help to change or transform the system? And as Reverend Dr. Theoharis mentioned in her presentation, the system isn't working for all. How do we really change to transform that? And as part of this shifting, we're looking at, we as Franciscans, the Franciscan economy of all is gift, and how do we share that gift? And what's the relationship we have? And we've also started engaging with the economy of Francesco, that the Pope convened prior to the pandemic, and there is a North American hub. And that has been one of the avenues for us to amplify what we're calling our impact investing, where we're seeking private equities or cooperatives that really help to bridge the equity gap and or help our planet to restore. As this continues to unfold, part of our reflection is engaging and discussing with other like-minded faith-based investors, vetting together the opportunities through different platforms such as the Economy of Francesco and the Catholic Impact Investor Coalition. And some of the examples that we've shifted some of our funding to, or really using as an area of impact to flesh out these areas, is a first-time fund whose plan is to turn businesses whose owners are retiring, that have mainly a minoritized worker pool, with ESOPs or employee stock ownership plans, where they're going to be training the employees with the necessary skills so they can take the leadership in the company, and giving those employees ownership and equity, or investing in purchasing cooperatives who have, as some of their vendors, minority owned and run companies, or a credit union who only grants loans for clean energy purchases such as solar panels, energy efficient furnaces, or electric vehicles.
Thank you, Sister Sue. And I appreciate the self-reflection process that the FSPAs went through in terms of thinking about that pay equity gap, and also that you thought about potential issues of compression, that if you raise the wages for the lowest paid, you also have to think about compensation adjustment for all the other workers. And then as well to hear about the great impact investing work that you're doing. I think it's great examples that hopefully SGI members and others who are listening to the conference can take back to them. I want to remind folks that if you have questions for our panelists, please put them into the Q&A box. We are going to shift to Q&A probably in about 5 minutes. So what I'd like to do is, and Sister Sue started to touch on some of this a little bit, but I'd like to pose sort of a final big question to each of our panelists, which is, we've talked quite a bit about the challenges that we've seen both from the pandemic as well as inequities within society, the asks of workers. And so I want to end on hopefully a little bit more of a positive note, and ask each of you to share some thoughts on either what gives you hope sort of in this moment, and maybe more specifically, what are some solutions that you see going forward, either in the short, medium, or the long term. So I will, maybe Edgar, we can turn to you first, and then to Kevin and Sister Sue.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. To be perfectly honest, what gives me hope right now is that workers are finding their value. You are seeing now that people are understanding that they have options, that they don't have to actually work in a place that may not respect their work, that may not value their work, that may not pay them what they're worth. I think that to me is just so illuminating. And it isn't just from sectors of folks that are unionized, it's also folks that are not unionized as well. And I think that to me is just so exciting. And I feel like the more that people understand what they're worth and how they're valuable members of society and that they deserve to be treated fairly and paid equitably, it's a win-win for all of us in society. So I think that's what gives me a lot of hope. It really does. And I think overall, for us, this past year, we actually filed several shareholder proposals at corporations to conduct racial equity audits. It was the first time that this type of proposal actually was up for consideration. I'm really excited and proud to say that we have 2 companies that agreed to conduct the racial equity audits. They were in the press. BlackRock, the largest global financial services firm, has agreed to conduct it and will be doing so next year. And then another company, CoreCivic, the private prison operator, is also underway with their audit now. And so we feel like those are things that, as we ask companies to really think about what they want to do and how they want to show up and really want to be leaders in this space, that we would encourage them to consider conducting one of these types of audits in their facilities. And I think these are hard conversations to have. No one actually, wants to have conversations about race. Our country is dealing with so many issues related to race. So these are not easy questions to ask, hard conversations. But I think in order for us as a society to really continue to try to move forward, we need to have these conversations and really think about what are the things that we can put in place to try to help us move forward once again.
I'd say for me, Caroline, is really what gives me hope is conversations like these, right? That we are actually having the conversation and really talking about kind of topics that, I know traditionally in the workplace and here at American that we would not talk about. Even prior to this meeting, I was in a room where we were talking about kind of a racial representation at leadership ranks, having conversation with our senior leaders, talking about what actions we need to take to really continue to close the gap, which I mentioned earlier. So those conversations are being much more deliberate. We're being much more intentional. And so it does give me hope to know that we're not kind of skirting around kind of conversations anymore in topics, that we're actually not only talking about them, but even putting actions in place and then putting things in place to hold us accountable, right? So we're measuring our progress, we're reporting out on our progress for sure. I think from a change perspective, it really is about starting from the top and even with our boards. And so we are now, being more upfront and not upfront, we are now providing the board more information around what we're doing from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. Quarterly updates on how we're tracking against our goals. We are now making commitments to them, and I think that's a huge piece of it, right? So as we think about accountability for our senior leaders responsible for making decisions for the organization, that really is going to start with the board, and we are now from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective engaged with the board in a way that we have never been before. And then obviously with everything that's happened with the pandemic, our board has been a key piece of helping guide us as an organization and kind of being our checks and balances to ensure that we're doing the right thing to take care of our team members and our customers. So, I was just speaking earlier internally in the organization about, it really is about us creating mechanisms in the organization that support these things that we're talking around equity. And those mechanisms will build the trust with our team members that our systems really are equitable and fair. And so we're continuing to look at ways that we can create these supporting mechanisms for the systematic change.
And I'd like to echo one of Kevin's comments about conversations like this are really what gives me a lot of hope, because on this Zoom, in the webinar, it isn't only one slice of society that is represented here. It's multifaceted, and that we're actually able to dialogue, and that this awareness that was really highlighted and raised during the pandemic isn't going away. We can't brush this under the table any longer. And the resolutions and engagement with the companies continue to gain traction, as Edgar shared with the ones that were, we're gonna, like, this never happened before. So it's only going to go forward. And as we as shareholders are more vocal about what we want and reward the companies for making the difficult choices and changes, as Kevin has talked about, they're going to be relevant. And I think those companies are going to be rewarded by people utilizing their services. And so I think there's just a lot of hope by everything being exposed and the willingness to discuss.
Perfect, thank you. Well, I'm going to open it up to Q&A, and I've seen some questions coming in through the Q&A box and the chats. So maybe the first question that I'll talk to three of you goes back a little bit. We heard from Reverend Theoharis, and I thought she posed a really great question of, you know, what does it cost if we do nothing to address poverty, to address inequities, to address climate change, all of these interconnected issues? What does it cost if we do nothing? So often we hear about what does it cost if we do something, and certainly that is the debate that's happening in DC right now around the Build Back Better agenda and the legislation. So I guess the question is, sort of, what else do we need going forward? If we think about the cost of if we do nothing, and some of this maybe gets a little bit to the question of wages and whether a rise to $15 an hour is sufficient, but what more do we really need to see to get to some of what Reverend Theoharis was addressing in terms of really addressing all of these systemic challenges? So I'll open that up to all three of you. I know, big question.
Yeah, you know, as I sit here and I think about several things, and you know, $15 an hour is not going to pull people out of poverty. It's not, but it's definitely on the right trajectory, right? But I also think about other crises that are facing our nation, and the retirement security crisis is one that is not really discussed greatly. And I think that's a challenge. And I think overall for me, when I think about, you know, people getting ready to retire, how woefully unprepared they are. And I think, you know, there's been many efforts to try to go ahead and there's been efforts to try to go ahead and address some of these issues. But I do think that the state of Illinois, the state of California and Oregon, and I think others have passed this private retirement security legislation that really allows for private sector workers that if they're not offered any kind of retirement benefit in their place of employment, that they can contribute to the state plan, and it's portable. And I think that's really important, right? Because if this person decides to leave this employer and the next employer doesn't have another type of retirement benefit, they can just go ahead and keep making contributions. And I think that's key, but you know, because if they were to leave one employer to another employer and they had to roll over their 401k to this next employer, unfortunately, working people, if you give them a check of $4,000 or $5,000, you know, life happens, and if they're, you know, gonna have to pay off a bill, you know, need to fix their car or need to put a down payment on their, you know, next apartment, you know, unit, they're probably going to use that money for those life expenses. And I think that's challenging. So I do think that retirement security issues are really important things that we need to continue to elevate in ways that that are currently not being done so.
Thanks, Edgar. Thoughts from Kevin, Sister Sue?
I think if we don't do anything, nothing's going to change, and it's only going to continue to, the divide is going to only continue to grow. And I think there's going to be very few people content or happy. And I think it's going to cause people of faith to really question what can we do. And it's going to, I think, this is going to help bring people together in a common mission.
Yeah, and I would just, echo on a couple points. I mean, I agree that we have to do something, right? So doing nothing is not an option because if we do nothing, then things won't change. And, I agree with Edgar as well, as like we have to start somewhere. So we talk a lot about that internally here at American. So when we think about some of the problems or challenges that we're looking to impact or solve, these are things that have been going on for hundreds of years, right? And so really, we can't expect to see wholesale change overnight, but what we can start seeing is progress and steps towards the right direction. And so as at American, that is what we are committed to, is taking the steps and making the changes necessary to ultimately have meaningful and sustainable change, because that's important as well. You want to ensure that you are doing things that are sustainable and meaningful, so we don't revert back and find ourselves having these same conversations around the same things, a few years from now.
Thank you, Kevin. I see a question that's come through in the chat, and I think this continues to build off of our conversation. And it's, what do each of you see as the future of dignified work? And again, I think this goes to some of the themes that we've been teasing out this evening in terms of what we heard from Reverend Theoharis, and in terms of attending to the poor and ending exploitation. And I think about, there was an article in the New York Times today that talked about how childcare for some people costs twice as much as their mortgage, and certainly what Sister Sue raised with what the F.S.P.As have done of raising wages, and from both Edgar and Kevin, of what you've done in terms of respective workforces and helping to provide for workers and their needs. But maybe if you have any sort of quick comments or thoughts on what do we see as the future of dignified work, and what does that entail, or what does it look like, and maybe what do we need to achieve it?
I think part of the dignified work is going to go to what Edgar and Kevin have both spoken about, and it's really respecting the person for the work they are doing, no matter what the work is, but having real respect for that work, because I am not capable of doing the work of cleaning or being a pilot or anything like that. So to really respect, and I would say pay for that work so that we have greater distribution of equity. And it's really, I think it goes back to the human dignity and respect for each person.
I would say I agree with totally around the human dignity for each person and respecting, every person. And I think also as well, it's about understanding the challenges that our team members face, and not, for one, we can't expect them not to leave it at the door, right? So before, and it was, hey, you come to work, you leave kind of all your challenges and issues at the door, and you come to work and do your job. Well, work and home and things are so interconnected now, and there's so much happening in society. We as organizations have to do a better job of listening, understanding, and then determining what do we need to do to best support our team members, and then understanding that they are multidimensional, right? So one size fits all approaches sometimes don't work. And so being agile, being nimble, being flexible, all the things that we've talked about throughout the conversation today, but that really shows then your team members that you do respect and care for them, because you're really understanding personally what matters to them and how we as an organization can help.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add, except for just to once again underscore that it is about respecting people and their work and their contributions to the team and their organizations they're a part of. And I think with that respect means that you respect us, you protect us, and you pay us.
Perfect. I think we need to put that on a sign. That's like a perfect t-shirt slogan to take forward.
You can Google it, it's there.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have a couple minutes left before we wrap up, and maybe sort of a final question that I'd like to throw out there. And we've touched on this a bit, Kevin. I think you provided some great comments about the accountability and trust. So I really think about, we're having these great conversations, and certainly from some of the investor perspectives, it seems like we're hearing more and more from corporations that they're on board with a lot of the themes that we've talked about, they support addressing issues of systemic inequity, of supporting workers. But I think there's always this fear, I think, especially amongst people who are living and breathing this work, that is this just a moment in time, and how do we keep this momentum going? And maybe especially in light of, with the Build Back Better agenda and concerns about it's stalling in Congress, and whether, critical components of the reconciliation bill are going to get cut due to, partisan issues. So I guess sort of the big question is, one, how do we keep this momentum going forward? And as well, what are the accountability measures that we need sort of personally, at a community level, at a corporate level, at a national level even, to ensure that this continues to go forward, and that what we've been discussing today really gets put into action to protect workers, and to ensure that our society and our systems are really supporting everybody. So I open that. Final thoughts from each of you.
I think it's more frequent conversations such as this, where we hear each of the perspectives, and then we can support one another and those that are doing the work, and call out. Call out is not the best term, but really hold up those that are, and ask those that are lagging to really look at their peers that are able to do the work.
Yes, and I agree. I think it's for us, from a corporation's perspective, it is hearing from our shareholders, our customers, our team members, from everyone that's kind of invested into the organization. If they see something that we're not upholding, if our actions aren't matching our words, and holding us accountable to the more frequent check-ins and conversations and dialogue, and talking about the things that we are doing. But it really is about holding us accountable to the things that we say. So not being afraid to have those conversations, challenge us, and it's coming from everyone, again, that has a vested interest in the success of the organization. That's the only way that we'll be able to keep the momentum going.
Yeah, from our perspective, I think for us last year, when we actually had the opportunity to take a step back and look at all the statements that were being put out after the social unrest that were taking place, and so many corporations issued these statements, and it was great, and they got these press hits. Our thought was like, okay, well, how do we then engage these companies to make sure that these aren't just statements that are being put out there, that we are actually seeing that there is some progress being made? And so, to Kevin and Sister Sue's point, we have to engage those corporations we're invested in to see what are they doing, how are you making progress, what does this look like, what are the metrics, how are you measuring? And this is not just a one-time conversation. These are going to be conversations that are going to be ongoing for the years to come. Systemic racism is something that has happened in our country for hundreds of years. So the cure has to be systemic itself, in order for us to make sure that we know that this isn't, this isn't something that we're just doing for this year, that this is something that's going to be going on, for years to come. And I think that's really important.
Perfect. I think that's a great ending. And Edgar, I love that line, that the cure has to be systemic as well. And I think each of you have touched on both the challenges, but as well the solutions, and the recognition that it takes a village to achieve what we're really seeking out to do, as well as just this long-term commitment. And Kevin, I appreciate the recognition of, especially from a company perspective, of the disclosure and the transparency, and the openness to being called out if you're not perfect right away, and that's okay, but it's a journey towards working towards a better system. So I want to thank all of you, and ask the Zoom participants sort of virtually to join me in thanking all of you and celebrating your participation. I really appreciate all the contributions and the great comments and insights. I think it's given us great food for thought. As you said, it's the first of hopefully many conversations going forward. And with that, Chris, I will pass it back to you.
Thank you, Caroline. I'll echo your remarks. This has been a deep, probing, and challenging conversation. We have a lot of work to do, as Edgar pointed out so clearly, and it's a long journey, but I believe that you all have equipped us better for that journey than when we began this afternoon. Thanks to our keynoter and our panelists. We appreciate the way you have advanced this conversation about building a better economy for all. Thanks to our sponsors. Your generosity strengthens SGI in its mission. Thank you to our members who do this important work to build a more just and sustainable world for those most vulnerable by integrating social and environmental values into corporate and investor actions. And I need to extend my sincere thanks to Sister Peggy Boehm, Dan Trito, Cindy Boland, Ed Fitzpatrick, Caroline Boden, and Natalie Wasik and Frank Sherman for serving on our conference committee. And thanks to you all for this, for your time this afternoon. And if you'd like to share a little more time, we are offering a virtual social. The link is in the chat, and we hope to see you there. So with that, thank you all, and we can re-adjourn to the other space if you're able to join us.